When we look at the impact of religion on ideas about medicine, it's really important to understand just how influential the church was. And when we talk about the medieval church, we're not talking about a single building, as we're perhaps accustomed to when we talk about church today. We're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, which was a tremendously powerful and influential organisation that spread across Western Europe. And pretty much every village in Western Europe had a church in it. So it had a little branch of Roman Catholicism operating in it. And in England, the church is estimated to have employed 1 in 6 people. So those are people, out of every 6 people, 1 would be directly relying on the church for their living. As well as that, it also is estimated to have owned 20% of the land in England, which then meant that it was a landlord as well to a lot of people. And is very, very wealthy. It has the right to collect something called a tithe, which is a 10% tax on everybody's income. Everybody has to go to church on Sunday. If they didn't, they could be fined. It has its own courts, so any churchman who commits a crime is actually protected from the king or the government of their country by the church courts. And the church can also charge ordinary people if it feels that they're living sinful lives. It could criminalise and punish them for that as well. But perhaps most importantly, the church has a monopoly on education, because anybody who can read and write in medieval times either belonged to or was taught by the church, and anything that was written down by members of the church. It would be written by hand by monks. So that means the church controls effectively everything that is read, everything that is written, and everything that is preached and agreed with as well. And that means that it can have a massive influence on how people think of their bodies and how their bodies work and why their bodies work and why their bodies don't work as well, and what should be done about it. Now, when it comes to explaining disease, the church has a number of explanations. So if we go to causes of disease, over here, one cause that the church gives for disease is that it's a result of evil in the world. The church sometimes taught that disease was caused by the devil, who is an evil spirit who in the Bible is God's enemy and is working to make the world a worse place and to turn people against God. So sometimes when people got ill, the church would tell them that it was the devil at work, and as part of that they might also tell them that it was caused by witches casting spells because they were working with the devil, or sometimes by evil sprites or imps or similar. And this fits in with the church's way of looking at the world, which is that the world is a battleground between good and evil, and between God and the devil. So sometimes when people got sick, the church said it was because the sickness had been caused by a devil. However, the church did also sometimes claim that sickness was caused by God. So sometimes when people got ill, the church would say that that was brought on them by God, and there are a number of reasons for this. One was as a punishment for sin. When people were living bad lives that went against God's instructions, the church might look at their illness and say, you are ill because you have been breaking God's laws, and to heal yourself you need to live a better life. When there was an epidemic, that was used by the church to illustrate the idea that whole populations had been moving away from God and had been living lives, a whole country was living against God's law. So sometimes that was their explanation. Sometimes they taught that God sent illness as a test for people, or because suffering was supposed to be good for you and turn you into a better person. They taught that it was to purify people's souls and to turn them into better people who would get to heaven quicker. Now, one of the convenient things about this for the church is that they can use these explanations to prove that God exists. If you believe that God causes disease, then whenever somebody gets a disease, then it proves that God exists. And if people get better from disease, you can use that to prove that God conducts miracles. So that can be quite an important part of this. Sometimes the church used disease as a way of proving God's existence. However, the church does also have influence over some of the more scientific ideas, and it has an influence on the medical universities that are springing up around Europe at this time as well. Now, when it comes to scientific explanations for disease, the church tends to favour Galen. And his ideas around the four humours. And the reason for this is that although Galen wasn't himself a Christian, he did believe in one God, and he did believe that people had souls. And both of those are in agreement with what the Catholic Church thought, so the church encouraged people to follow Galen's ideas, and they could actually imprison people who asked too many questions about Galen. When we look at the way the church treated disease, it did control and in some ways limit people's understandings, but it did also in some ways improve people's understanding. For one thing, because members of the church could write, and because they wrote a lot of Greek and Roman texts down at the fall of the Roman Empire, that means that a lot of the discoveries made by the Greeks and the Romans about medicine were saved by the church. Because if the church hadn't written them down, then they would have been lost. And the other thing to say about the church is it did believe in caring for the sick. It believed that God wanted good Christians to care for the sick. And as a result of this, the church was responsible, for example, for setting up nearly 500 hospitals in England by 1400. So in some ways, the church did limit people's understanding of medicine. In other ways, it expanded them. Now, as a final case study, really, to have a look in terms of the church and disease, there was a disease called leprosy. Now, leprosy is notable because it appears in the Bible quite a lot. Sometimes it's sent as a punishment by God. It is a horrible disease. It attacks people's nerve endings, which means that they can't feel their fingers and their toes, and quite often they lose them as a result. It also causes really nasty ulcers on people's inside and outside of people's bodies, and ultimately can lead to paralysis and death. Now, medieval people didn't know how leprosy spread, but they believed it could be spread through breath. It can't, but other diseases can, which shows that they did have some understanding of disease. As a result, they didn't want lepers, people with leprosy, to mix with other people, and if they couldn't be removed from the community, then they would be forced to wear a cloak and ring a bell to warn other people off. However, the church did set up a number of what were called Lazar houses, or Lazarus houses, to care for lepers, and sometimes they also ran something called leper communities or leper colonies. Squeeze this in here. Perhaps on isolated islands where people with leprosy could live away from the population and reduce the risk of disease. Now, that's the influence of the Roman Catholic Church on medicine. However, there is another religion at play here, and this is based around something that occurred between the 8th century and the 14th century in places around the Middle East, particularly Persia. And this is called the Islamic Golden Age. At this time, there was a very strong community of Islamic scholars who made massive advances in a number of science-based subjects, particularly things like maths and astronomy. And as a part of this, they also made huge strides in medicine. So the first hospital was set up in Baghdad in 805 AD, which is very early. And by the 1100s, nearly every major Islamic town had a hospital. And some of these hospitals were really well equipped. So, for example, a hospital in Cairo in 1283 had different wards for mental and physical problems. It had a mosque and a chapel, and it also had a surgery and a pharmacy and a library and lecture rooms and so on. Now, there's a number of Islamic scholars, therefore, who have a big influence on medicine, and some of their books are translated into Latin and then spread to the medical universities in Europe and up to England. So we're going to finish off by having a look at a few of those. One of them, from Persia in the 9th century, was called El-Razi. And he was the head of the Baghdad hospital. And he wrote about 50 books based on his own findings, but also the work of the Greeks like Hippocrates and Galen, as well as Indian and Chinese discoveries as well. Let's move down a little bit so I've got more room. And those books were translated and used in Western Europe quite extensively. There was a man called Ibn Sina, although his Latin name is Avicenna, and he wrote something called the Canon of Medicine, which included a description of 700 different drugs that could be used to cure illnesses, and that was used for 500 years in Europe after his death. So it was an incredibly influential and important text. There is another called Al-Zawari. Forgive my pronunciation of that. Zawari. Although his Latin name was Albucasis. And he was known as the father of surgery. And he published a book with drawings of operations and also surgical instruments. He was also the person who discovered that haemophilia was hereditary and could be passed down through families. So he had a big influence on ideas around surgery. And then finally, there was a scholar called Ibn Nafis. He was actually Syrian. There we go. And he lived in the 13th century. Now, he challenged Galen's ideas around circulation, and he suggested that blood got from the right ventricle to the left ventricle of the heart by going through the lungs. So he really sketched out the basics of pulmonary circulation 400 years before William Harvey did. And this wasn't really paid, nobody paid attention at the time and he was ignored. But in the 20th century, people reading his text realised that he'd actually made gigantic strides in understanding around the way that the heart worked and the way that blood pumped around the body. So he's another Islamic scholar who ended up being incredibly important. So these ideas about religion are feeding into understanding of medicine as well.